Hello again. Welcome to Anxiety Disorders. It's like they're going to kill me for that 20-minute lecture, so I'm going to make this one talk less. It's just so interesting. No, there's a lot of good stuff here in the abnormal psych. Again, it's a little bit easier to understand because it's around us every day. We've heard these things, whether it's ninth grade health, whether it's people in our family, things that we deal with. But then there's a lot of information that you kind of need to know around it, like the history of it and the different methods and treatments and all that kind of stuff. So I know it's a lot of content. And in this one, I actually typed in the definitions for you guys. So now those little yellow puppets. Okay, so anxiety disorders. We're actually going to look at anxiety disorders. There's 5 different ones. 3 of them are classified as kind of these general anxiety disorders, and then 2 of them have been actually taken out in the DSM-5 and classify them separately, even though they involve an anxiety underlying basis. Okay, so the anxiety disorders we're going to cover in this lecture are GAD, so generalized anxiety disorder. You do need to know, I've seen that many times just referred to as GAD, right? Generalized anxiety disorder. We're going to talk about panic disorders, phobias, and then the 2 that have been separated out are the OCD, the Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, and then the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. Make sure you have those ones kind of written down like this as well. So the reason why, I'll explain a little bit later, but those 2 have been taken out is because there's some kind of anxious feeling that is associated with obsessive-compulsive disorder, like that you feel anxious if you don't wash your hands, but once you do that thing, then it goes away, right? So there's a component of anxiety, but not necessarily just the underlying cause of anxiety. Okay, so let's talk about GAD first, or generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder happens, so first of all, you need to know that it happens as prevalence, right? Is 2/3 of the people diagnosed with GAD are women. And in this type of anxiety versus a panic or a phobia, it's a very what they call free-floating anxiety. It's for no specific reason why the anxiety comes. Remember we talked about in our last lecture that when it deviates from the normal, that everybody feels anxious sometimes. Everybody might even feel anxious a couple times during their week, whether it's because of a test or waiting for results. That's a very normal feeling, but that remember that this is when it takes over our life. So either it's emotionally distressful for the person, that it gets in the way of them functioning in an everyday situations, and even going back to our DSM-5, if you've ever heard the term a high functioning anxiety, it might be they have all these things, but on that score on the bottom, the global score, they're still able to day-to-day kind of function within their day-to-day life. Okay, so general anxiety disorder, if you've ever felt anxious, you know what this feels like. It's constant autonomic nervous system arousal. So remember the autonomic nervous system versus that we looked at that sympathetic nervous system, right? So this is good review, right? So you've got your nervous system, you've got your central nervous system, which is just the brain and spinal cord, right? So you've got your central, and then you have your autonomic, right? And you've got your sympathetic and your parasympathetic under your peripheral nervous system, right? So central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic, meaning constant heart. We'll look at some things here in a second, but you're kind of in that constant state of arousal, right? So heart being a little bit fast, a little bit tense, apprehensive, just that continually kind of feeling like you're, anxious about things happening. So again, continually tense, apprehensive, constant ANS arousal, free-floating anxiety, which means it's not around something specific. It's not around a test that you have or a competition that you have or waiting to find out results or things like that. Those are normal. So generalized anxiety disorder is more specific, constant, all the time. This is in contrast with a panic disorder. Panic disorder is a type of anxiety, but it's more called an attack, right? An anxiety attack, right? These strike, instead of having a constant level of anxiety all the time, it's a sudden, brought on. My mom has panic attacks. They're horrible to watch. But intense fear, heart beating, sometimes they lose feeling in part of their body, right? So going numb, can't breathe, tremble, dizzy, comes out of nowhere, right? It's often followed by the fear of another attack. So sometimes the general anxiety comes around having a panic attack, which is not which is not good, right? It's very, it's actually counterproductive, right? To be anxious about the next thing happening. Because smoking is a stimulant of the autonomic nervous system, right? So increases heart rate, increases, or your pupils dilate, right? All those things, sweaty, because nicotine stimulates the autonomic nervous system, smokers actually have double the risk of having these panic disorders or panic attacks. But again, the difference between the two, like between the GAD and the panic, is constant all the time versus sudden, intense episode. Sometimes these last a minute, sometimes they can last longer. And again, sometimes the repercussions of it is that there's that fear that another one's going to happen. If you're driving, if you're walking, things like that, it kind of keeps people in a state of like wanting to be safe and being afraid to go do that same thing again, thinking, which again, that can bring on another panic attack. All right. Again, under those general anxiety disorders are phobias. So phobias are considered part of an anxiety disorder. There's a couple different types of phobias that you do need to know about. There's specific phobias, social phobias, and then agoraphobia. So specific phobias are down here, actually. So there's a chart here. This is percentage of people surveyed. Fear versus phobia, right? So you can see that there's definitely more people that are afraid of these things, right? So the number one thing being animals and height, blood and flying. But phobias are generally much less than a general fear, but they are, they do kind of follow that same trend, right? So animals, things like spiders, right? Heights, people don't like heights. But you do tend to find that the things that people are most afraid of are the things that we have most phobias, but some of them are more along the same level. So like closed spaces is a higher percentage phobia than like waters or storms, versus here where it kind of has this general overall trend. You do need to know the term agoraphobia, which is a fear of or avoidance of situations, crowds, and wide open spaces. So like just not wanting to be anywhere where there's a bunch of people, or if there's really big places that are not contained, or really big crowds with not a lot of order, right? So that is agoraphobia. Specific phobia is here. Social phobias are things that we talked about, like fear of public speaking, it's like extreme shyness, right? Not being able to sleep the night before, something where they have to think that they're going to be like scrutinized, classroom presentation, right? Everyone gets like nervous about classroom presentations. Someone that might have a social phobia would be like could not even sleep the night before when thinking about that they might be socially embarrassed or scrutinized. These people also sometimes don't like to eat in front of people, right? So not even just like talk, but eat. And actually, hold on. You can write down social phobia. It used to be called social phobia, but I was just looking. So now it's called social anxiety disorder. So anxiety. Oh my gosh, I can't type. Disorder. Right? So social phobia is now called the social anxiety disorder. And I've covered everything else here. Oh, you've already talked about that. So there you go. All right. So those are the type of phobias or form of phobias in contract with so something around. Remember, general anxiety disorder is kind of this free floating, right? It's just this general thing all the time. Phobias are very specific around certain events, people's, places, and things, right? Phobia nouns. Okay. All right. The next two we talked about used to be under anxiety disorders and now separate in the DSM. One is OCD and one is PTSD. So OCD is obsessive-compulsive disorder. We're going to talk about in the next chart. You do need to know the difference between an obsession, which is a thought, and a compulsion, which is a behavior. But again, going back to what's normal versus not normal. It's normal to like worry about once or twice that did I lock the door? Like, did I close that? Did I wash my hands well enough, right? But when we talk about obsessive-compulsive disorder, we're talking about like 10 times, right? Going back and checking, you make sure like you lock the door. And it's kind of more everyday things, or washed your hands, or put things certain places. Sometimes you might be checking a lot, like, your email because you're waiting for a response, or you're making sure that you turned in this one thing because it's such big points. Like some things like that are okay to check more than once, or they're not abnormal. But when it's like everyday occurrences, obsessing, so whether those are thoughts, and then compulsive, which is behaviors on them, is what classifies OCD. So some pretty common ones like Howie Mandel here. He's a very famous TV host. Might be might be too old for you guys, but had OCD about cleanliness, germs, right? So germaphobes, things like that. So here's the chart of obsessives and compulsions. You do need to know the difference between these two. So here's some pretty common ones. So I meant, again, thought is an obsession or behavior, right? So like an obsession is a repetitive thought. So maybe you're constantly thinking about dirt, germs, toxins. That's a number one, like you might have called like a germaphobe. Number one thing or obsession. Something terribly wrong happening. So being constantly obsessed with like you're thinking about like there being a fire, that someone's going to die in a car accident, that you're going to be sick, right? Symmetry, order, and exactness are more associated with things like when we think about OCD, people that are really organized, like everything needs to be like lined up, that needs to be in this different order. And exactness, sometimes these are just things that people like, right? But when you can't stop thinking about it, that's when it's considered an obsession. Okay, a compulsion is a behavior, repetitive behavior. So again, they kind of go together though, look, right? So the number one compulsion, or most percentage reported compulsion, is hand washing, bathing, right? Like clean, because of this concern or thought, right? I'm constantly thinking about it, and so then I'm constantly going to do something about it. And that's where the anxiety comes in. This creates the anxiety, the obsession creates the anxiety, the compulsion makes it go away. Right? So the repeating rituals in and out of door, up and down a chair, sometimes is associated with that something horrible is going to happen. Like I need to touch these two things like this, touch these two things like that, right? And that makes me feel better that nothing's going to go wrong. And then the checking doors, locks, appliances, right? 46%, car brakes, homework, right? Going back and checking over is supposed to, that behavior is supposed to reduce anxiety that you feel while you're thinking about it. Okay, so that's why it is under that anxiety disorder. But again, OCD, need to know the obsessions and the compulsion, know that one's a thought, one's a behavior, and then some of the most common ones we have. Okay, the last thing that we have here is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Actually going to start down here. So your book, I was just reading this thing about 9/11, talking about how half of adults, by the time they're adults, have experienced a traumatic event. Whether that's a car accident or seeing something horrible or something that's like happened in their life, like a death, all right, traumatic event that we would classify. But only about 1 in 10 women, but only like 9 out of 10 of those people, or 1 out of 19, move on from it in something we call post-traumatic growth, right? They move in a positive direction. Hi, I'll be right then. And then the other ones, though, so we only have like 1 in 10 women, 1 in 20 men. Sorry, someone just came in the classroom. Will actually just, develop PTSD, right? And PTSD is that post-traumatic stress disorder. We see this in war veterans, right? But it doesn't have to just be to a war situation. It could be events like we talked about, like 9/11. For women, one of the most common ones is rape or some type of abuse. And it's a constant, like this shell shock, or this sudden, like, fear that comes on, that's activated when the thoughts or memories come out around it. All right. So, if they're thinking about those things, they go back into this very, like, fear, can't move, can't, like, talk about it. Sometimes like like a swaying back and forth and a repetitive phrase. Sometimes people feel, we see that a lot with PTSD victims, right? So traumatic event, shell shock or battle fatigue, and the anxiety usually comes around those thoughts kind of coming out of nowhere or being triggered somehow, right? So that's why it used to be considered under the anxiety disorder, but is now separate from those in its own classification. Okay, so understanding anxiety disorder is actually a really quick, like, good review for just, I promise, just 2 more slides over why, like, where these things develop, right? Because there's a couple different perspectives. We have the learned perspective and then the biological perspective, all right? So going back to how we learned about classical conditioning and observational learning, right, is that sometimes fear can be conditioned and reinforced because it's associated together, right? So fear conditioning, so we have a stimulus that's kind of generalized, and then it's reinforced because it is scary, or it is this, right? So we saw, like a spider jump once, and we've seen that happen over and over, and we hear things about spiders being bit. Maybe you saw a movie, right? And it's a learned behavior. Same kind of going back to the lecture one, like self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I'm so nervous about getting up and talking to everyone. I don't sleep the night before. I do horrible talking to everyone. I get a bad grade. See, I knew I wasn't good at talking to everyone, right? So it's kind of like those two things are paired together, and then continually reinforced because of either the behavior or the things that are happening because of it. The other thing is observational learning. So you might have a horrible fear of heights, like because you saw someone fall from heights, right? You might have a fear of flying because you saw, a plane crash video, right? So those two things are learned behaviors, not born. The other model is the biological perspective. Our fears, I really like talking about natural selection, right? Is that we should have these like innate inborn fears of certain things that are going to cause the end of the species, like fear of like heights and flying and poisonous snakes and spiders, right? There's reasons why we're not like phobic of little bunnies, right? That the things that tend to be more dangerous, people have more fears and phobias, anxiety over. The other thing is there's been research on what we call the anxiety gene. You remember glutamate and GABA? So GABA, glutamate. So GABA is the inhibitory, glutamate is the excitatory. Right? Remember we talked about glucose and glutamate, kind of excitatory, that it might be overreactive in some people, so it causes more of a reaction to things because it's increasing that response instead of GABA, which inhibits it. Inhibits it. And the last part that you need to know there is that there's actually this part of the brain right here, the anterior cingulate cortex, that's been associated with being overactive in people that do suffer from some type of anxiety disorder, one of those 5. So when they do brain scans in people, they see overactive areas of this. Again, they think because that's tied to glutamate, which makes it more excitatory than inhibitory. Okay, look at that, 17 minutes. I still talk too much. All right, our next lecture will be on our major depressive and the other types of, schizophrenia, somatoform, and all that jazz. I'll see you guys soon.